Cold promises ride harder than bullets, and sometimes the quietest man carries the heaviest storms. When a stranger saves a life on the edge of winter, the valley holds its breath, because mercy can change more than fate. And on this frozen morning, one choice will echo farther than any gunshot. Snow lay in thin, wind-pressed sheets across the land, clinging stubbornly wherever shadow met earth, while the sky held the dull sheen of hammered steel. A narrow river carved through the valley, its edges glazing over where rocks slowed the current, and the air carried the sharp scent of pine sap drifting from scattered trees. Asherbon rode at an unhurried pace beside the water, his horse stepping carefully through brittle brush glazed with frost. His coat had stiffened from days on the trail, dust and cold locked into the fabric, and each breath left him in short, pale bursts as his eyes stayed fixed ahead. He moved like a man who had spent too many years thinking and too few speaking. 5 years of war had worn the sound out of him, and the ambush that took his younger brother had silenced what remained. Guilt rested on his shoulders heavier than the rifle hanging from his saddle. Once he had worked cattle with neighbors, laughed beside campfires, lived in the easy rhythm of ordinary days. Now he kept mostly to himself, tending a narrow strip of land by the river, and riding into town or camp only when someone needed something done. Delivering medicine today was the sole reason he had left the quiet of his cabin. The Apache camp appeared ahead near a cluster of cottonwoods, smoke curling upward from 3 low fires. Asher slowed before entering, not from fear but from respect. Children paused their work stacking wood and stared. Dogs lifted their noses, sniffing the unfamiliar scent. 2 warriors stood near a lodge, spears upright, their watchful eyes cautious yet calm. Asher swung down without a word, unfastened the canvas sack from his saddle, and carried it under one arm. He gave a brief nod to an older man approaching, his face lined by winters and years, then set the sack at his feet. Inside were herbs and dried roots he had traded for days earlier. His intention was simple: leave the medicine, turn back, reach his cabin before dusk. Routine kept his thoughts steady, kept memories from creeping too close. He had already turned to lead his horse away when a shout rose from deeper in the camp. Several men hurried past him toward a lodge, urgency tightening the air. The sound struck something in his chest, the same sharp tone soldiers used. When someone went down, before he could stop himself, he followed. His boots crunched on frozen ground as he reached the lodge entrance. Inside, a fire burned hot, smoke lingering beneath the hides. The chief lay on furs, one hand pressed to his ribs, breath uneven. Blood had dried dark against his clothing. A young warrior explained quickly. Raiders had passed in the night, a stray bullet, no healer close. Asher listened, jaw tight, reading the fever already forming in the chief's eyes. He had seen wounds like this before, too many times. Without help, the man would not last. Asher rolled back his sleeves, voice low but certain. Boil water, bring cloth. The warriors moved at once. He cleaned the wound, packed herbs, tightened cloth to hold pressure. The chief winced yet made no sound. Asher worked steadily even as the smell of blood stirred old memories. The last night with his brother. Breath fading in dust, but he pushed the images aside and stayed focused. Hours slipped by. The fire cracked, wind pressed against the lodge walls, and people came and went quietly waiting. Asher remained, watching each rise and fall of the chief's breathing, adjusting the bandage when sweat soaked through. His shoulders ached, but he did not rest. He did not know these people well, yet leaving felt like abandoning something he could still prevent. He had made that mistake once, when his brother asked him not to split from their line. That moment still replayed in his mind. Night settled over the camp, voices softening as people drifted back to their lodges. Asher stepped outside, only long enough to splash cold water over his face and breathe the sharp air. Fatigue settled deep in his bones, yet staying felt easier than returning to a cabin, where silence pressed just as heavily. He sat on a log by the fire, coat pulled tight, rifle across his lap from habit, watching flames until his thoughts quieted. A woman passed, carrying a bucket, a child peeking from behind her leg. Asher kept his gaze on the fire. Too much eye contact unsettled people. He understood that. Most strangers brought trouble. He brought medicine and left. At dawn, the lodge flap shifted. The chief stepped out, leaning on a spear but standing on his own. The camp gathered quickly, forming a loose circle. Asher rose and removed his hat, relief moving through him quietly. He had done enough. The chief regarded him with steady respect, then raised his hand. "You saved my life. Choose one daughter to honor your deed." 4 young women stood near the fire, silent, none meeting his eyes. 3 stood straight, prepared. The 4th lingered slightly behind them. Shoya. Asher noticed her last. She seemed young yet unbroken, jaw set, eyes alert. Dirt streaked her cheek, and a tear in her deerskin dress hung low at the shoulder, exposing skin where someone had grabbed her during the raid. The neckline had stretched, revealing more of her chest than she wished, and she tugged the fabric up quickly, wrapping her blanket tighter. Embarrassment flickered across her face, but she did not shrink. She stepped half a pace back, not forward. She was not offering herself, she was guarding what remained. Asher felt his stomach knot. He despised the idea of a woman being handed over, memories of ruined towns and careless soldiers rising in him. His voice came quiet but firm. "I take no one." The chief studied him, then nodded. Once in understanding, Asher turned toward his horse, ready to leave, needing distance from decisions that were not his to claim. Then he heard soft footsteps behind him, hesitant but resolved. Shoya stopped beside him, blanket pulled close, breathing uneven. She said nothing, only lifted her chin slightly, bracing herself. Fear was there, but also choice. Whatever safety she had known ended with the raid. And she saw in him something steadier than the uncertainty behind her. He lifted his hands slowly, giving her space to refuse. Instead, she placed her hand into his, cold and trembling. He helped her onto the horse with careful restraint. The ride back was silent. She sat straight, holding the blanket closed. When the horse jolted, the fabric slipped once, revealing the curve of her shoulder where the dress had torn. Asher looked away at once, eyes fixed ahead. She was not a prize. She was someone frightened, choosing the only path that felt safe. He would treat her as a guest, nothing more. If she chose to leave tomorrow, he would not stop her. They reached his cabin at dusk, smoke faintly rising from the chimney where he had banked the fire. The small structure stood weathered but sturdy, lonely yet safe. He opened the door and stepped aside so she could enter first. The single room held 1 bed, a table, a chair, and a stove in the corner, tools hanging neatly along the wall. The air smelled of wood smoke and old coffee grounds. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep by the stove." She nodded softly, whispering thanks, then sat near the fire, hands stretched toward the heat. Her dress shifted again, and she quickly tightened the blanket. Asher busied himself with the stove, giving her the dignity of not noticing. Later, snow tapped lightly on the roof, and wind rattled the shutters. She slept curled beneath the furs, breathing uneven at first, then gradually steady. Once her fingers twitched, as if she dreamed of danger. Asher moved closer, slow enough not to startle her, resting his hand lightly near her forearm until her breathing calmed, then withdrew. He sat back and watched the fire fade, listening to the quiet rhythm of her rest. His body felt worn, yet grounded. He had saved 1 life and sheltered another. For the first time in months, the cabin felt warmer, less hollow. Outside, the river slid beneath its skin of ice and distant coyotes called. But inside, 2 strangers rested in a room built for one, each trying to trust the fragile peace of the moment. And Asher felt, quietly and unexpectedly, that he was not alone. Morning came with a thin grey light pressing through the cabin window, the kind of pale dawn that felt more like a pause than a beginning. Asher woke the way he always did, slow, alert before his eyes fully opened, listening first. The stove had settled into a low glow, the faint crackle of embers the only sound inside. He pushed himself up from the floor, muscles stiff from the cold, and glanced toward the bed. Shoya lay on her side beneath the furs, blanket drawn close but no longer clutched in fear. Her breathing was steady, and the tension that had held her shoulders the night before had softened into something closer to rest. For a moment he simply watched, making sure the quiet was real. He had learned long ago that peace could be fragile, that sometimes it vanished the second you trusted it. But the room stayed calm, the morning still. He stood, fed a few sticks of wood into the stove, and stepped outside with the basin to gather snow. The valley stretched silent under a pale sky, frost clinging to every branch, the river whispering beneath its crust of ice. His horse stamped softly near the shed, and he brushed its neck before heading back inside. Shoya was awake now, sitting upright with the blanket around her shoulders, eyes tracking his movements with quiet attention. "Cold morning," he said simply. She nodded, studying the room as if mapping it again in her mind, confirming that nothing had changed overnight. He poured water into the kettle and set it to heat. The simple routine grounded him. Fire, water, the rhythm of small tasks. "You sleep?" he asked. "Enough," she replied. "No bad dreams?" He gave a small nod, understanding more in that answer than the words carried. They ate in companionable quiet, corn mush and coffee, the steam rising between them. The silence no longer felt strained. It felt like space both of them could breathe in. Afterward, he set tools by the door. "I check the traps, bring wood." "You stay warm," he said. She hesitated only a second before answering. "I come." Outside, the cold bit sharp against their faces, but the sky had cleared to a pale blue that promised a brighter day. They walked side by side now, not quite touching, but no longer with the distance of strangers. At the river bend, he checked the snare, resetting it with practiced hands. She watched closely, absorbing the motion, learning the land the way he did, by noticing small things. After a while she spoke, voice low but steady. "When I left the camp, I did not think I would live long." He kept his eyes on the trap, letting her speak without interruption. "Raiders came fast. Fire, shouting. Some fought, some ran. I ran." She paused, drawing breath. "I thought if I stopped I would be taken." He straightened slowly. "You don't have to run here," he said. The words were simple, but he meant them with a certainty he rarely allowed himself. She looked at him then, searching his face, as if weighing the truth. "I know," she said after a moment. They walked back as the sun climbed higher, the snow beginning to soften under its light. Inside the cabin she moved with more ease, setting the kettle again, sweeping a bit of ash from the hearth without being asked. The space began to feel shared, shaped by two sets of hands instead of one. Days passed quietly, marked by small routines, gathering wood, mending tools, cooking simple meals. Shoya's laughter came first as a brief sound, almost surprised, when Asher's horse nudged her shoulder for grain. It came again later, softer but easier, when she burned the first batch of bread and he ate it anyway without complaint. Trust built not in grand gestures, but in these small moments that asked nothing in return. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she spoke again, voice thoughtful. "My people, they will rebuild. They always do. But I think my path is here now." Asher watched the flames for a long moment before answering. "You don't owe me staying," he said. "I know," she replied. "That's why I can choose it." The words settled between them with a quiet weight. Not a promise, but something just as steady. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the valley. Snow receded from the hillsides, the river ran freer, and the air carried the first hints of thawed earth. With the change in season came a change in Asher too, subtle but real. The silence he carried no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a place someone else could sit beside him. One afternoon they rode out together, following the ridge where the land opened wide. The horizon stretched clear and bright, the sky vast above them. Shoya looked out over the valley, her hair catching the wind, and for the first time he saw no trace of fear in her posture, only presence. "You saved my life too," she said quietly. He shook his head. "You chose it," he answered. She smiled faintly at that, understanding the difference. When they returned to the cabin, the sun was dipping low, painting the walls in warm gold. Asher paused at the doorway, taking in the small details, the extra cup on the table, the blanket folded neatly, the sound of another person moving inside. The loneliness that had once filled the space was gone, replaced by something quieter and stronger. That night, they sat by the fire as shadows lengthened across the floor. No grand declarations, no sudden revelations, just the steady comfort of shared silence. Outside, the river moved freely now, no longer bound by ice. and the wind carried the scent of thawing earth instead of snow. Asher leaned back against the wall, watching the flames, aware of the calm in his chest. He had spent years believing he carried only loss, only the echo of what he could not change. But life had a way of turning gently when he least expected it, of placing a new path beside the old one. Shoya looked up from her mending, meeting his gaze without hesitation. There was no fear there, only quiet certainty. "We'll manage," she said softly, echoing his words from weeks before. He nodded, a faint smile touching the edge of his mouth, the kind that came without effort. "Yeah," he said, "we will." The fire burned low, the cabin warm against the cooling night, and beyond the walls, the valley settled into peaceful darkness. Two lives, once drifting in separate storms, now moved forward together, not because fate demanded it, but because they chose it day after day. And in that simple choice, the quiet man who had carried the weight of the past finally felt the future open, wide as the horizon beyond the river, steady and bright.